discussion regarding rental units in our city. So we're going to begin this meeting by standing for a pledge of allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Are we taking roll tonight?
We can, sure.
Let's do it.
Mayor Milan,
I am here.
Councilmember Anderson,
Present.
Councilmember Sampson is not here. Was he expected to be here? I've not heard from him.
I believe he's expected to be here.
Councilmember Shepherd.
Here.
Okay, great, thank you. So if everyone recalls, on our agenda for the past couple of months, well, several months at this point, we have been talking about rental, establishing some good rental ordinances for our community, short-term and long-term rental. So there was a lot of discussion at our last meeting. We decided to table moving forward on anything and open up, have a public hearing for anyone who may want to come and discuss this. We have a few people in the audience. We have everyone here. Hopefully everyone's prepared and is here with all their questions. And I will open it up to our city attorney to give a brief description of why we're here, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So, obviously, we're here, just as you indicated, to talk about short-term rentals, and I'm glad that council decided to do a workshop. I think it is, it works better. We'll have the ability to have a free back and forth between all of you and the community, to be able to find out what would make sense for this body, for the community, as far as your wishes when it comes to rentals, both short-term and otherwise. A lot of communities are different. This community will be very different from any other community. So I think it makes sense that this body have a conversation about what makes sense for it. And I'm here, and along with, obviously, the city manager, city clerk, we'll take copious notes, we'll listen carefully, we'll hopefully be able to respond to all your questions to the greatest extent possible among all of us. If not, we'll be able to hopefully collect all your questions and come back with information and be able to get to some proposed ordinances that this body can then adopt in the future. If you recall, the two original ordinances that I proposed, or when I first proposed them to you, dealt with inspections and registration. And the reason I limited to those, if you recall, in that first conversation, was I thought it would be easier to parse these. Rental is such a large topic. It'd be easier to parse it out, to make it as small a unit of an ordinance as possible. Otherwise, it can become rather cumbersome. And I know that even with this, sort of narrowing of the issue, it nonetheless has become a little bit of a topic that has required a lot of back and forth, obviously. So hopefully we can address all your questions. If these make sense, let's improve these to a point where you are comfortable in voting or dealing with them going forward. If they can't be improved, we can start from scratch and go, begin somewhere else, whatever makes sense for the body. But those ordinances, I know you've seen them quite a few times in front of you over the meetings, and hopefully we can all address those questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with sharing a couple of emails that we received from residents. I'm not going to share their name or address or anything because I don't know if they would want that done, but I do want to share their thoughts. So the first one has to do with, I just highlighted it and then moved it, so of course I can't see it. So the first one is concerned about Airbnbs that are being allowed in a residential area. They're asking us to look into Ferndale's rules. Clawson is a small community and businesses should not be allowed. We're zoned residential. I have watched these people come in and out. Garbage cans always left out. New dogs that neighbor dogs can't get used to. You have to care enough to not just have these businesses treated like rentals. Please do something about this and no more allowed. So this person clearly is saying if it's an Airbnb, it's no longer residence. It's no longer a residence in a residential neighborhood. It is now a business inside of a business inside of a residential neighborhood. Another resident shared a very lengthy very well thought out post, but or email, I should say, but I don't want to read the whole thing, so I'm just going to say that she lives next door to an Airbnb unit that is consistently booked with guests. Having an Airbnb neighbor means that there is no sense of neighborly camaraderie or assistance. You can't ask your Airbnb neighbor to watch for packages or ask if they mind if you use their side of the fence to trim your privacy bushes. There are random cars parked on the street. Snow removal is often delayed as no one actually lives there, and garbage cans are often left out or not taken out or in promptly. Other concerns are that the people locally are renting them and then having large gatherings of people on a regular basis. And the car issue, as we've mentioned before, is always an issue because we don't allow parking in the street overnight past 2 p.m. up until 6 p.m. unless you want to donate to the $20 city police fund for parking your car in the street, which is not advised because that gets costly really quickly. So this person also states that our council needs to be passing ordinances that will encourage the spirit of community and not destroy it. And basically a lot of the same concerns that the other people had. So I'd just like to bring that to your attention too. So with that being said, is there anyone in the public who would like to speak? I will open the floor for public discussion.
I mean, I don't know how this is supposed to work, if you want all my speaking done now, or if you want to, if I'm allowed to just come up and add to. I don't know how you want it to go, because I have a lot of things to say about the, particularly the Airbnb sentiment. Much of the same was shared online. I posted that this meeting was tonight and encouraged people to just come out and share and participate. There were members that were working and couldn't make it tonight, but they shared same sentiment. A lot of them knew of, another Airbnb that just even in Clawson. I assume the back to this is because maybe we have gotten complaints and we need that mechanism to be able to trigger and enforce and have some type of, grasp on how we might address them, how we might, capture violations. So outside of, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I don't entirely remember how far I went into things last time. But in terms of setting, at the basic, the bill that's coming forth at the state of Michigan, I felt like this ordinance doesn't meet that basic. But I also feel personally that we can go beyond that, and I agree with much of the sentiment about keeping our residential neighborhoods. I'm absolutely a proponent of, individual property rights. However, once it's functioning as a business, it's a lot different. There are ways that I found that you can kind of regulate it. A lot of cities that I looked into were more of like a bed and breakfast style, and they allowed shared space. Though the only time they allowed it in residential areas would be to have like a bed and breakfast style. I found that to be common, and I'm looking inside Michigan and outside Michigan. Although there is this constricting, maybe it's going to come down. It seems from articles I read, it's not going to happen before elections, but maybe at the end of the year. However, there's so many things with that bill. And number one priority being house, affordability with homes, and it goes against the Michigan housing plan in freeing up affordable housing for property home ownership.
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
Even though I said come up and speak.
Sure.
Would you please provide an overview of what we're talking about, what the legislation that's proposed she's discussing, and then we can kind of hit it, because I think that a lot of people probably have,
Absolutely.
they're like, what the heck are we talking about here? Let's just go
absolutely.
backwards a little bit. And I'm sorry, maybe have a seat for a second
Sure.
while he's
Yeah.
doing that.
No, it'll be brief. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we do have, state of Michigan has several competing statutes right now making their way either through the House or the Senate. There's at least one in the Senate. And these are ordinances that attempt to do several different things. The ordinances that Ms. Redmond is referencing are ordinances that the various cities have adopted throughout Michigan. There's going to be a moment of a clash at one point or another between the ordinances that the municipalities have drafted and are attempting to draft or will draft in the future, and whatever is being proposed by the state. A lot of the ordinances, for example, such as the one that was mentioned in Ferndale, and there's quite a few municipalities that have these ordinances, they all start from the first basis of regulation starts with registration and inspection. Obviously, as municipalities, we have the authority to regulate and ordain on account of health, safety, welfare of the public, and monitor this process in that fashion, which is why registration and inspection makes a whole lot of sense. As to where each municipality has fallen on that imprimatur of legislation considering health, safety, and welfare with respect to registration and compliance and inspection will vary, obviously. What may make sense for us in Clawson, the kind of community that this is, size, demographics, nature of homes, size of lots, all those considerations will be different than from I'm going to just pick a community, but it will be different from Lake Orion Township, where we have 10-acre lots and per home. So your consideration here will be markedly different than a place like that. What we have on account of the state, there's several bills. There's one bill that talks about, it's a Senate bill, it talks about, it's probably the broadest one out there, but it deals with issues such as excise tax. It deals with issues such as there's a component in there that talks about, deals with preemptive. It has an effect that will be determined to be preemptive of any action that any municipality will engage in as far as regulation and or inspection. That said, we don't know what's going to come out of these various bills, and we don't know what that final statute will look like when and if it does. And our thought, certainly my thought, was always, a community such as Clawson, because it has more of an interest than most communities to want to regulate rental homes, particularly short-term rentals, because of the size of the small lots, because of the very issues that some of the residents have written, have communicated, because it would change here more so than most other communities, the nature of the community that you have. So I think there's a need to want to be proactive to the greatest extent possible. What that being proactive looks like, obviously, will be determined by you. There's on the I know that in thinking back to those bills, there's a couple of House bills as well that are that talk about various aspects. They talk about insurance, how to insure, how to properly insure when it comes to the short term versus long term. There was one bill that dealt with, and I'm attempting to locate it right now. It talks about transient homes, and there's various definitions about how we, I know at least I received at least a couple of communications about what that means about transient versus hotel rooms, and the difficulty with giving you a larger overview as to what we might see is that we don't know what's in the past. My concern, personally, as an attorney, that I have, and why I had an impetus to want to move sooner rather than later and be proactive rather than expect and wait what the state does, was for the following reason. I think I would have an issue if the state comes in and occupies the space, as the state can do by way of a statute. It would give us a very little leverage down the road to be able to protect the community, so to speak, as far as changing dynamic of the community. If we have something like registration and inspection, whatever you may think that looks like, I think it would work best for us. The building department will have a system to collect the information. They'll have a system to have inspections. I think, and actually the city manager pointed out to me that in the proposed ordinances that I had, at least in one of them, I think I had a 3-year period. He indicated that perhaps it may make sense to do a 2-year period because that is reflective of what else we have on our books on other aspects of it, current rental ordinances. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. I agree. That's something that we ought to modify. So those are some of the concerns that brought us here, brought us to the moment where we perhaps need to think about this. But again, ultimate solutions will depend on your ultimate wishes.
So can we put, I know the answer is no, but can we require a buy-off from neighbors if someone wants to do something like this? Because this is, right, we talk about registration and inspection. Any of us who've had the joy of owning rental properties knows that when they show up, they're amazing, and you're just so happy they're going to be here with their little ones, and you're going to feel so happy to share in their life with them. And it doesn't always stay that cheery, right? And as far as inspection, I'm assuming most of these properties are utilized weekends, and we don't have enforcement on the weekends. You talk to neighbors now who have people who put their trash out on Thursday night or Friday, and it sits there until trash pickup on Wednesday, and there's no one at City Hall or any of the responsible parties from Thursday at 4 until Monday morning at 7:30 or whenever, 6:30, whenever people start. And then they've had to endure whatever for that few days of period, which might be just a few days on a calendar, but if you're enduring someone's deciding to clean out their basement and leaving everything out early, or, change their toilets, and you get to look at that on Selfridge for a week, that doesn't make people happy, right? And our number one concern should be ensuring that we have safe, comfortable neighborhoods, not just for the property owner, but for the people around them. And I know we're restricted by a lot. You can't force anybody to do or be anything, but we can encourage them. And so when we say registration, that's fine, right? The place is going to look good because they need it to look good to be able to rent it out. So that's not really even our issue. That's like going to be a non-issue. But inspection, when are you going to inspect? You're going to inspect on Monday morning or Tuesday by the time the call gets to somebody, and those people are long gone, yet they wreaked havoc all weekend, and people couldn't sleep, and people's dogs were barking, and nobody could park near their home, or all of those things, right? So the everyday living experiences are what I would be concerned about.
And I don't, and obviously, I'm grateful that this is a workshop, so anybody can chime in at any time, because I know that, we have more than just us, But
Mayor, if I can inject, so from what the city attorney is saying, are you implying that we should act sooner rather than later to get something on the books to have greater standing should the state come down with a decision?
Yeah, I think my ultimate thought is that we ought to, there's no impetus upon us to do anything, okay? At the end of the day, you've survived this far without it, you could survive longer. Ill-advised, I wouldn't advise it. I think this is one of those ordinances that I had eyed for a long time and that I had wanted to bring up to this body for a long time because, for the reason stated, we're a community with small lots. Our homes are close to one another. The impact of all those concerns that the mayor's has listed so far is disproportionate in Clawson as opposed to, again, Lake Orion, because of the proximity to our neighbors. But I think, Madam Mayor, you're talking in an ideal world, I would agree with you. You're speaking about inspections like, routine inspections. The inspections that we're talking about for purposes of an ordinance like this that we can reasonably mandate would be something that is every other year, right?
Right, I understand that, and that's not good enough, right? So let's say someone files a complaint on Saturday.
I'm sorry.
Or Friday, right? So, because there has to be more than just the initial inspection,
Absolutely,
right? The initial
absolutely.
inspection is nothing. Like I said, they're going to pass. They're going to have a really cute place that they can post on all the sites and say, hey, stay here for $250 instead of staying somewhere else. And I've stayed in Airbnbs It's fun, right? Like, it's kind of creepy. I did it in Europe. I was like, I don't know what's going to happen here, but it was good, right? It's a good experience in the right place. Every place I stayed was a full-on business, right? That's all they did. They didn't live there. Nobody, although I did one in my daughter's college. Spent an exorbitant amount of money to stay in someone's home for graduation weekend, right? So that was someone just capitalizing on the fact that you could pay your mortgage with someone being in your house for 3 nights, which yay for them, yay for us, all good. We don't have probably that draw here, but we have to be, my concern is there has to be more than a registration and inspection that is conducted at the onset and then every 2 years. It can't be just that, because it's the everyday usage that counts, right? It's not that. Like, nobody that lives next door or down the street from one of these places is going to care about that. That's not going to impede anything that might potentially happen on a day-to-day basis. And I will say most people are great. Most people are not going to come into your house, trash it, wreak havoc on the neighbors, and just cause a disruption. But there are also those people who, I paid for this, I can do whatever I want, I'll be gone in 2 days, what are they gonna do to me, right? So we have to worry about that for the people who live next door.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
So I believe you're talking about like an enforcement mechanism to abide to, and there's a lot of cities that I've looked at, like Houston was beautiful, right? But we're not Houston. We don't have a hotline, like to maintain that type of enforcement mechanism and handle complaints. That would put a large burden on, like you said, nobody's even here on the weekend. So the enforcement mechanism, I agree, it's missing things. I guess what I feel like this ordinance is missing is how we might want to zone them. As Mr. Nujai was saying. Rennis, yes. He was stating that the impact in Clawson. So the state bill that's coming down the pipe right now, we don't know if it's going to happen, but let's say it's 30%. 30% in Clawson is a lot. Could you imagine if the state came in and said 30% gets to be Airbnb? With what I said last week, in that the opportunity in our housing being close to these secondary markets or primary markets, us being kind of a secondary to, I think that there needs, and I don't know, again, I'm not an attorney, but I would rather err on the side of being a little bit more conservative in that way at first, and then if the state comes in, then we get preempted and we have to kind of conform and switch a little bit of that. But I do agree, and a lot of it's probably going to come into, we got to just roll and we're going to figure this out as it's rolling, because we don't have that system just yet. And I'm sure that doesn't sound great, but there's going to be some trial and error, I'm sure, of how best to handle complaints. But I do think equipping our residents, no matter what, if you decide, look, residential, there's a housing crisis. We don't want people coming in. We would like to have full-time residents or renters that are here all the time, because when you're thinking of health and safety, allowing your kids to go in the backyard and play with strangers next door every day is not a good feeling. And I don't have an Airbnb, but I can only imagine what it might feel like if, I'm sending my kids outside, if I'm always wondering. So if you do decide to zone it in a particular way, and I know we haven't talked about zoning, I don't know if that's something you were going to send back to us or how that was going to work out. Yeah, but I would think that council would have a big say in where we're moving with the ordinance in terms of zoning, right? Do you see a problem with going a little bit more conservative than even the bill that is a possibility? Or do you feel
not at all. This body has done it before. So zoning is a little bit a different issue, right? If we're talking about zoning with respect to these kinds of ordinances, yeah, first of all, it would have to start with the planning commission, and we'd have to have hearings there before anything. And of course, I agree, this body will ultimately be, the body to make those determinations, but nonetheless, the origination for all zoning matters pursuant to the Planning Enabling Act would have to be the Planning Commission. to me, to mix, even though they all will work in tandem, to mix those concepts, the zoning of it, even though it makes sense, actually, I think they all work together. They all work in tandem. But I think I would, because of the kind of issue that it is, I would think, and of course, this body, or all of you can correct me at any time and can say, no, I think we need to mix it all together. It needs to be one big, large, comprehensive bill. I think you tackle it, as piecemeal. You talk about registration and inspection first to make sure that you have that regime in place, right? As from a building sort of official perspective to begin with. So that the next step would be enforcement mechanism, I would think, then zoning, and then anything else that we can think of. And the question that you pose, should we be more conservative than what's to come? Yeah, I think we need to, the way I would think about it, we need to do what makes sense for us at this particular point in time without necessarily any concern for what's coming, even though that we know that something is coming.
Legally, how frequently can we mandate an inspection on Airbnb?
I think, the limit, it has to be within reason, right? So it's that we're dealing under that larger category of health, safety, welfare. So we can do probably something once a year at most before we begin to be challenged, okay? But when you have registration and inspection, and we create an enforcement mechanism, the enforcement mechanism, which was what the mayor and Mr. Redmond were talking about, that's somewhat different in nature. We can go out there based on a complaint for a specific residence, for whatever that specific complaint may be, separate and distinct from the registration and inspection issues.
Right, and your ordinance that you wrote does have
Yes.
recourse for violations of ordinances after the first, second, third, fourth. After the fourth, in 24 months, it's a wrap. I mean,
Yes.
that owner and that location can no longer operate as Airbnb. And just for some context, I'm not saying that this is not important by any stretch of the imagination, but today, August, and Nick and I, they did a little research as far as how many we have. We have 5.
Oh, 5?
We have 5 on Airbnb. In VRBO, there's 0.
Yeah.
So I'm not downplaying this. This is somebody's bamboo.
Yep.
And it's something that we need to address, but contextually, we have it in certain areas, and if we can go to 1 year, I would just like to get something on the book so that we can contain. I'd also like to remind everybody, too, that according to the master plan, there are, I want to say, 5 or 7 priorities. One of them, all of the city manager candidates picked as their number 1 priority for the second round of interviews, and that was the preservation and the characteristics of the neighborhoods in Clawson. So I would think that this, taking some kind of stance, I'm not sure that anyone up here is advocating for the Airbnb industry. Obviously, people have rights to exercise that, but in an effort to comport with the master plan and protect the integrity of the neighborhoods, it seems that taking the most rigid stance in regards to Airbnb may be a good start for us to at least get some traction and progress on getting something on the books.
Yeah, I did that research a couple weeks ago. I found 3, so obviously there's maybe 2 that popped up. But then again, I was looking out to Christmas time and where you may be needing to have an advance notice for that. The home that was described by the email that did come up. There's another one that's on 14 Mile, which doesn't look like it would lend itself to being that cumbersome on the neighborhood, all right? But I think it's also had 2 levels to it that they would rent out. So how that works with traffic flow and so forth, that may be another issue. So that goes back to the safety and well-being. So it goes also to my concern about complaints and how we're logging complaints for that and what the triggers are and so forth. So as long as that there's a mechanism within this ordinance that does that says, hey, you've got 3 within the month, right? Let's shut this down, and it doesn't necessarily require an inspection at that point, right? So, because you could have an inspection and everybody knows it's coming, and guess what? No, this place is spick and span, even though they had 20 people in a party with dishes broken all over the place, and. Again, I'm concerned that this may be something that arises in the future. We don't have that many now, but I really want to get in front of this because who knows what the trends may be. We don't have short-term lodging for that. Like hotels and motels around here are a scarce commodity. We have one, I think that's it within our confines, and there's not many outside. So people would like to have that opportunity, and I'm sure that'll come up as, more homes turn over. But I'd rather take a stronger stance, get in front of this language. You were addressing initially the email that I sent regarding the definitions of this. And one that came up that I saw that was part of a redefining ordinance from last year. Was it last year, 2 years ago?
Yes,
I can't remember.
2 years ago.
And one of the terms came up was tourist home.
Yes.
And what that means. I couldn't find the definition for it.
Yeah,
So-
it was done as part of planning, if I remember correctly. And this is in defining specifically these items. I think that's a huge component of this, right? This is why also I split it up I propose to split it up into short-term Airbnb and other, to be able to carve those distinctions outright. And to add to your earlier point, part of my reasoning for originally bringing it up was I read some article probably sometime last year that talked about private equity firms getting into the market of purchasing homes for these purposes. And I think, again, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that I am. I think we are that much more susceptible to that, and the net effect in a community like Clawson would be disproportionate as a result, which is why, I agree with everybody that spoke so far. Conservative, yes. Rigid stance, yes. We're not hearing the opposing view. That's fine with me. So I think we move, in that general direction. Absolutely.
We're in a really unique spot when you think about the surrounding communities. And Aaron, you're talking about being a secondary market. So primary markets would be, in your opinion, what would they be?
Well, I mean, my main two that stick out would be like Birmingham, where they, Troy, they don't have a downtown. We're kind of like Troy's downtown, right? I would say Royal Oak. Like I ride my bike to Royal Oak. Birmingham, also ride my bike there. I would think that those are two of the communities that also drew me to Clawson. These are strong markets. Surrounding Clawson. So, yeah.
And that's part of the reason why my concern is that when you have communities such as Troy, Birmingham, Royal Oak, that when they look at our location and the proximity to everything, the ease and convenience, and that we have smaller homes that would be easier to turn into for, say, Christmas time or things like
Active
that.
market.
We're just on the cusp of possibly seeing something turn over. And again, my concern is we need to try and entice families to stick around, even in these smaller homes, so that we can get our schools back online. That's something that I was thinking about was, the registration process and how many homes do we have already that aren't listed on VRBO or Airbnb that are registered as secondary residents, not as
Right.
primary residences? And would those be subject to registration?
Yeah, so that's a different registration for which we're already accounting for. Not necessarily a part of this unless the use is the use that we're proposing here. And funny you mentioned that. I think in one of my, I forget, at one point council said, let's go out there and collect information from the community. One of the people that I obviously spoke to was Joan from the DDA and building, and that was one of Joan's points when it came to. One of Joan's points was we probably need to move. She didn't know at the time how many we had. I certainly didn't either. And she indicated that if it is a low number and if it is 5, this is the time to do it, so that we put the process in place
absolutely.
now. as opposed to-
I'll just put it in perspective of automotive industry. It's like the time that you get ahead of an engineering problems when there's 5 vehicles on the road rather than 600, because at that point in time, you're talking about the R word, right? So. that becomes a problem.
Okay.
We should also consider that Clausen already has pretty, I don't know what the number is, if anyone knows it, the percentage of rental units that we have in this community is
It's
pretty
about 30%.
substantial.
It's about 30%,
That's
at
what I
least last
thought,
time I checked,
yeah.
which is, it's good. I mean, it shows we're kind of, in terms of fair housing, I think we're kind of meeting that goal. They talk about 30% usually, right?
Yes.
But that could
But
turn over
considering
quickly.
your point, to add to it, now you're defeating the 30% margin.
Yep.
I
Is-
agree.
I think that's your point.
Yeah, and I think-
I think that's why we're doing this exercise, so.
Yeah, and I think not to cut you off, but to consider, there is another Airbnb thing that's coming. I don't know if you've heard of it, but like people they'll lease an apartment and then they'll turn it into an Airbnb. So they're not even like the primary like renter there, and they're just like these, little YouTube entrepreneur guys that are like, yeah. So I do think that we might want to consider, if we're not, if we're going to exclude residential and say, but we might allow it in multifamily, we might want to consider putting a certain percentage within a multifamily, because, or not doing I don't know, just something to keep in mind, that there can be that. And of course, the landlord will probably be the primary enforcement mechanism there. But if somebody buys a 4 or 5 unit and just rents them all out as Airbnb, that's also something that we might want to consider. Just putting it out there.
And to the enforcement end, I mean, the particularly with Chief Smith, the approach that we've taken is, particularly of late, is one, not on these specific issues, but similarly situated issues, is to issue the citation, whatever the citation is, to both homeowner and renter, and then we figure out the true culprit in a civil setting in court, as far as who created the issue. We have that ability to do so in court, as opposed to at an early stage. When we do figure it out at an early stage, of course, we issue to the appropriate party, but when we can't, then we deal with it that way. So I think that addresses that point as well.
But for an Airbnb, most likely the complaint would be a nuisance, right?
Absolutely.
And that's harder to, they're going to be gone, like I said before. The culprit will be gone before we get to them, yet they wreak havoc and ruin someone's weekend, or, you know what I mean, or their 2 weeks or however long they're there.
Well-
So that's the concern that I have, like how.
Wouldn't the police still come there, or no? But I do think that that's an important component, because like the dog bite, I think about that, and like there was that missing gap, right, of being able to enforce or hold accountable. So there might be a police complaint, but does that actually convert to 1 strike out of 4 against them?
I mean, there's,
So in the mechanism that we
Code
have, yes, it
enforcement.
would. Yeah, there'll be
Yeah.
code enforcement related. It wouldn't necessarily be police, but I think the reference that both young ladies are talking about is, what do you do on the weekend when code enforcement is not here? So Friday, Saturday, Sunday is that downtime. Police would respond during that time, and they have obviously the same authority as code enforcement would. They could issue a ticket. But I take your point, because I think it would be least likely for that to happen.
Yeah, and how do the police have a log and say, oh, this is an Airbnb, so I got a secondary report that to code enforcement, like, is there a system that's going to trigger
Yeah,
code?
so, and that's my, my hope with respect to registration and inspection is to create an ordinance to create this ordinance which gives them the authority and the mandate to our building official to designate such a system, to add it, whether they add it to the BSNA or wherever they want to add it, or whether it's added under pursuant to code enforcement, and code enforcement is, in Clausen is under the umbrella of the chief of police. Wherever that system, it gives them the authority to be able to list it there. So we have a way to track, so that by the time you get to X number of violations, you no longer have that right.
So, but okay, so that has to be triggered either by the complainant or the police officer has to know, right? So basically, it has to be the complainant has to say, this is an Airbnb, they're
Not
annoying.
necessarily. Yeah, it could.
Or
but
whatever,
yeah, Or
right?
the police officer, or whomever the entity that's issuing the citation.
But he wouldn't know unless somebody told him, right?
Depending on the condition of the ground, you could, of course. It depends on the issue, I suppose, right? Whatever
Yeah.
the nuisance is.
Right.
The nuisance is, you're saying I'm sorry, I just now understood. I think you're talking about how they know whether it's an Airbnb versus not an Airbnb.
Yeah.
I apologize. Excellent point. Yes, I don't think we're going to quite mark them, but I think, I'll take any and all ideas to that end.
Yeah, so I think that's we might have an enforcement mechanism, but there's a missing piece between the police being able to talk to, and even Monday through Friday, right? Like even Monday through, they probably won't, residents are gonna call code enforcement even if it's 9 o'clock on Monday. Like they're gonna call the police officers, so without that mechanism, I
If
feel like
can
there's.
interject, to your point,
Yeah.
I don't think the ordinance gets that far in the weeds to address those aspects of management. We just need the enabling legislation
That's
so that
right.
we can
Thank you.
do what
That's
needs to
right.
be done.
I think, and I think, thank you, Joe. I think that's exactly right, and I think that's the point I was making, that Joan had made originally, and I was trying to respond to her. It is to create, for this body to create our ability to be able to start pursuing this, to create a system in place. What that might look like, he's right, it would be in the weeds as far as, us going and detailing at this particular point in time as to how we track them. But there's certainly a way to track them.
Every
It's
time
cer-
there's a dispatch for a police officer, there's a run report.
Well,
So, I
very
mean,
respectfully, I realize that ordinances don't typically go this far into but this is the primary reason why Airbnbs have the stigma, and I'm not an advocate for them, but it's because there's so many residents in so many communities that feel helpless, that feel like they're just a constant nuisance. So, and I'm not proposing you put it in the ordinance, but I feel like that's a huge component, like you said, that ability to enforce, because without it, you just have a bunch of very frustrated residents, right?
If I can add something at this point, I like where the conversation's going. I think we're all in the same mindset that we want to be as restrictive as possible. So the way I see it, an Airbnb is a hotel, pure and simple, okay? So the question is, are we going to encourage or discourage the growth of hotels in our neighborhoods? All right, there's 5,000 homes in this city, and we say we have 5 currently acting as Airbnbs. Rennis, how did the first 5 ever get started? Under what legal authority are they allowed to operate this way?
Under no legal, yeah, there is none. It's, Airbnbs are all operating under no legal authority,
Under what?
under no legal authority.
So are they treated as rental units? So rental units have ordinances defining things.
No.
They're not even acting under rental. All right. Then let me just question, here's one of the ordinances you had, 34.353. And under definitions, the first one is boarding house. A building arranged or used for lodging for compensation, with or without meals, and not occupied by a single family unit.
Correct.
Now, when I read that, that seems like a very broad definition. About the only restriction in there is single-family unit. In other words, you can only have one family unit in the building, lest it be defined as a boarding house. That's my, is that a correct interpretation, or?
I think that's an accurate reading.
Okay. Then moving on to line O, it says, where are we at here? It simply says, boarding houses shall not be permitted in the city of Clawson.
Correct.
So if an Airbnb, to avoid the definition of being a boarding house, would we have to confine it to one family unit?
What they would do, I'm sorry, yes.
Here's what I'm saying, it seems the definition of a boarding house is very broad.
Yes.
It's like the only thing that doesn't make it a boarding house is it ensuring you only have one family unit in the building.
Yes, sir.
So at this point, these Airbnbs, are we ensuring there's only one family unit in them, and thus making sure they're not defined as a boarding house, which is,
Are we ensuring that?
what, is there a mechanism, right? Okay, these 5 Airbnbs, they're functioning.
Yes.
And I don't know if we're doing head counts, DNA checks, or what, but according to the definition of boarding house, it's got to be one family unit, no more. If it's 5 guys from Colorado and California converged in a house and want to hang out to enjoy the local area, they apparently have turned into a boarding house. if they're not of one family unit. I mean, this is just my amateur's take on the
Well,
language here.
So I'll make 2 points with respect to that. First, the 5 Airbnbs that are operating right now are operating in the void, right? There's no legal mechanism for their allowing their existence, and there's no legal mechanism for withdrawing their existence in any way, shape, or form. By passing these 2 proposed ordinances, we begin our work towards establishing a framework for how we deal looking forward. The boarding house sections in particular were based on, obviously, council's direction. Those were not in my original proposed ordinance. I believe, personally, as an attorney, that they are too broad. Right? They're too broad, and I also believe that they, in an ideal world, should be located elsewhere, not necessarily here in these 2 proposed ordinances. But council deems it appropriate, and council may deem appropriate a lot of other, portions to add or take away. And this is your ordinance in the end, and we're going to work with your ordinance. I think your point is well taken with respect to going forward. But if we make this definition and we pass it as an ordinance of this body, and it becomes that, that you read is now the statement that we have with respect to boarding houses, and were a home, one of these 5 or otherwise, to fall under the definition of a boarding house, pre-existing the passage, the second reading and publication of this, they would be grandfathered in.
So,
I understand that's often how things go, so I'm thinking we need to cut off the supply of grandfathers at this point. Go
I couldn't agree more.
ahead, Mayor.
so the boarding house you added in to appease my concern over people renting out excessive rooms within their home that like this was a disruption to the people who lived around them. It doesn't meet the same definition that I really proposed to you. So you put it in, which is fine, but it doesn't mean anything, basically. So if we're going to use that logic, then the Airbnbs are rental homes already. So we could technically just say, you're operating a rental home, you are taking money for people to stay within your home, that constitutes a rental home. You have an agreement, you're not letting people stay here for free, you're exchanging whatever you exchange to secure that property and to ensure that you trade it back. So if we want to be liberal with all things, we can make any of these things fit, whatever it is we want them to fit, except the concern I had, that doesn't fit in here very well at all, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take your guidance, I'll take this body's guidance with respect to the definition of boarding homes and with respect to any aspect of it. Concerning your earlier point, and we'll amend it accordingly, of course, to meet, this will be your ordinance. So whatever the body wishes for it to read, it will read so, it goes without saying. However, your earlier point with respect to how to treat Airbnbs and their rental, I'm not sure that you're correct, because we have specific laws dealing with rentals.
What
that means.
establishes a property as a rental home? What changes, what would make something a rental?
I think the 6-month stipulation that it's
Yeah.
rented out.
It has to say 6 months?
Or longer, yes.
Okay.
So how do we, so are we going to have a stipulation in the Airbnb that you can rent your property out 6 times a year and there's nothing? Or you rent it out more than 20 times, there's this, more than 60 times, there's this? Are we going to do
I believe that
that?
actually is in the ordinance to a degree. I think it specifies a certain amount of times, I believe.
I read the ordinance, but it's not clear, right? There isn't, of course, that's a conversation that's not defined, but it's not well-defined in there either, because everything is
In what sense, ma'am, if I may, so that I can actually take note and attempt to modify it accordingly?
well, you would need council full approval to do that, so I don't know that everyone's on the same page as I am with
Yeah,
this
no, I understand,
conversation,
but I'm
so
trying to understand your point, that if we can understand your point, perhaps there is agreement, I'm not sure.
I'll send you an email and I'll go line item through it like I did before, and I'll give you all my concerns all at once. I'll be happy to do that to you.
And I'm happy to receive it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to receive it.
That's no taking for me.
Is the boarding house, that's not transient, right? There's the same renters in there?
So
the whole-
boarding houses, as a definition and as an issue in Michigan law, is an issue from, a long time ago. Hasn't been a thing in Michigan, and as far as definitions are concerned, in probably a generation. That's not to say that we cannot utilize it or that we cannot address it, but just conceptually speaking.
But weren't those typically like maybe I'm misunderstanding, but like World War II, was it, that there were a lot of boarding houses of people that they just needed to go work places quick, right? Like we need all these people here, short term, I don't know.
Yeah, transient homes, yes.
Yes. So that was like more turnover, more transient. And maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but you're talking about the amount of people from different families, or like the mixture. Like some of the ordinance I've read discuss people from different families, right? Like how many different groups of people are you allowing in one home? I don't know, is that what you're more going towards with the boarding house, or is it something that's more transient?
So boarding house came up because I had a question about specific renting of individual homes with multiple people. Multiple, not just like, your best friend and his girlfriend, right? Multiple people. That was creating havoc in, I know 2 neighborhoods that have them. I can name 2. And I came up with boarding house because I found it on local ordinances, right? I did a search myself because you didn't help me with that at that time. And I came up with the term, and you said, oh, it could apply. And then it was never added in, and then, we had a conversation, and then all of a sudden it's added in, but we're saying that it doesn't really mean anything, but we added it in. So thank you for that. But if it doesn't apply to anything, pull it out. Don't ever placate me or anyone else on this council or this council just to say something, because upon Councilmember Anderson's reading, it doesn't mean anything, right? Like anything could technically, we can almost make anything a boarding house. And it's not just old, it's on people's books now. You can go to local communities, type in boarding house, it's in their ordinances. Whether or not people think of them as what you're talking about, or what, communities built these massive places to bring people from the south up to get them to work quickly, and they stayed there until they could afford enough money to buy a little house around their plant or whatever. That's not the only use of that term, which I'm assuming which is why you also put it in there, because it's a little bit broader than that. So my concern was, which doesn't have anything to do with this specifically, what do you do when you have someone renting out their home to 6 people?
Sounds like
And
a
they can
frat
park
house.
4 cars,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it's not cool for the neighbors.
Is
Like, that
it
takes my
legal
neighborhood
to
away. That's not a
require-
neighborhood now.
Sounds like a boarding house.
Well,
it's
to me, it
not.
sounds more like a frat house, and I don't know what the
Oh.
term is. I'd have to look at literally, it sounds most comparable to like Western Michigan. I'm thinking, there's like 4 or 5 different guys. My brother went there, live in the house for a year. They're not transient, but I'm sure that there's laws that they're not allowed to go everywhere, right? So
We're getting hung up on the definition.
Yeah.
The definition counts, though, right? All of these definitions count.
If I may finish my point. You're getting hung up on the definition, and I think, and I'm not saying that your points are not valid, on the contrary. However, these, when you speak about these ordinances and their effect and how we need to define them and how not to, they need to be defined in such fashion to where they make sense in a court of law. Not necessarily to us as a body here. Above and beyond that, they need to make sense within the parameters that we have in courts. And when I tell you that, and please accept it as factual, yeah, laws are on the books and they stay on the books forever and a day until we pull them out. However, that being said, it is older language, and it doesn't necessarily qualify. So, for example, when we talk about a situation such as yours, the example that you provided, several individuals living in one home, unrelated, parking 4 or 5 cars. Is there anything against that?
7, just for the record.
Sure. Is there anything necessarily against, making that against the law, against current laws? Never mind Clausen. Overall, absolutely not. The way we define that we can have, as a community, limitations based on, to get to health, safety, welfare, we can have reasonable limitations and craft ordinances that have reasonable limitations, whatever that is. So in my original version, we talked about up to 2 people per room. Most communities have that. I think somebody mentioned Ferndale. When I remember looking at Ferndale's ordinance for registration and inspection, 2 people per room, right? These are the definitions that we have. For a maximum of 8 people, I believe, is Ferndale, and I'm pretty sure that's an exact quote. Up to 8 people. So that's a reasonable limitation, for example. Could we be more stringent? Of course. Do we risk a challenge? Absolutely. Are we willing to take it on? Sure.
So that's a reasonable limitation for inside the confines of someone's home.
Sure.
We have to consider there are other considerations, and parking is huge here. Like, you can't tell, if you have more than 4 cars in this community, you're probably hating life, right? Because you got to park one up against the curb, or you got to make sure your garage is cleaned. And bless you, people who have a clean garage.
I presume you would agree with me, and because I actually agree with you. I do.
So when we discussed this before, you said things like this, we could figure out if we could address them, right? To put in, to make sense. And the same thing would make sense for this Airbnb situation and for all of our rentals, period, right?
What is
We
that
can't.
thing?
Pardon me?
I'm sorry, you didn't finish the thought. What is that thing?
I did finish it. I was talking about parking. I was talking about
But here's the
specific
concern that
numbers
I
of
have.
parking.
Here's
So
the-
following that, that's what I was talking
Here's the concern that I
about.
have with respect to parking, because I don't disagree with you. But if we're going to say, we're going to put a limitation on parking, let's say, because parking is important in the city of Clawson, what limitation do we put on parking in the city of Detroit, in the city of Chicago, in the city?
We don't care about those communities. We care about our community, right? So
understand, but the law-
frustration that
the
we're going to look at
law-
Ferndale and what Ferndale does, great for Ferndale. Ferndale's not Clawson. Royal Oak's not Clawson. Birmingham's not Clawson. Clawson is Clawson. And while utilizing some of their documents to see what other people have done, doesn't mean those are the things that should dictate what we do. We are
No, ma'am,
unique in
that-
ourselves
that's not what
on every
dictates-
level.
That's not what dictates it, though. The point that I'm making is, I agree with you, but the point that I'm making is that the laws that we have in place, state laws, federal laws, a Fair Housing Act and things of that nature, they all eventually come into apply. And if we're going to limit people's ability to park, for example, if we're going to put certain parameters in place that limits people's ability to rent a house on account of parking issues, we're going to open ourselves to challenges down the road. We're going to open ourselves to, whatever entity, which will be some version of the Department of Justice that enforces the Fair Housing Act, to come in and challenge us in that regard. This is not a community that needs to be a test case for those kinds of limitations. That's my point. I'm not saying that I disagree with you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I understand that component, and I don't know what the magic number might be, but you can easily say there might be families that have 4 kids that eventually will all drive. That's 6 cars.
Correct.
I get that might be more constrict, but is there a component that might work to enforce this? And could it be something about a mixture of how many different families? I know that's kind of an older thing.
We wouldn't be able to limit the amount of, based on the family unit. Those laws have been declared unconstitutional, I think, back in the 60s.
So you can put as many different groups of,
Yeah, there's no limitation in that regard.
yeah.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to do so.
So you don't see any enforcement mechanism
Based on the family units?
or
Or
anything?
familial
She's
relations?
proposing parking. I'm like
I
relation
think parking is
to
more reasonable, yeah. Parking is more reasonable.
more
in that sense, yeah.
reasonable than relation. I
Absolutely.
still see that everywhere. So, but that's unconstitutional.
That doesn't
Yeah.
make it right, no.
So is there any other enforcement mechanisms?
No, I think I agree with the mayor. I think actually when we're talking, so most ordinances that we see in place, that I see in place, and actually this bleeds into, and that's probably what you see, based on my understanding of your work, you probably see it in agreements as far as rental agreements and all over the place. We have limitations on number of people per rooms is the number one. Okay, I haven't seen. But that's not to say that you can't place a limitation based on the amount of parking spaces and how you utilize parking. It gets to be, I would imagine it would get to be a little tricky because of the various rules that we have for on-street parking and things of that nature. But again, you can work around those issues. You could come up with some sort of a baseline standard.
If you're regulating they're businesses. We regulate other businesses for property, for parking.
absolutely.
Okay, if I could add something. I guess, again, returning to my main point, as far as I'm concerned, Airbnb is a hotel. Once you open a hotel up to next to somebody's home, you've probably impacted its values. You've impacted the quality of life of the people. Right now, we have 5 Airbnbs. We got 2 complaints that the mayor read off. So that's kind of a 40% failure rate at this point. So since I think we're all moving towards the idea of restricting things, let's start at one extreme and then Rennis, provide us advice as we can maybe roll it back into something less restrictive. So I'm going to ask the question, can we simply outlaw, restrict, ban all short-term rentals?
I think the answer to that is no.
Okay, so to some level, short-term rentals are protected by state law. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, not necessarily, actually. I don't know that we have anything, but, to outlaw, we're not, there's no specific law that protects their existence at this point, but they are a business. There's a business component to it. There's some rights for people to be able to utilize their property within, reason.
Understood, but a short-term rental is less than 30 days. Is that a correct definition?
Yes, I think it could be, yeah.
So that sounds a lot like a hotel to me. I mean, a short-term, less than 30 days can be
Commercial
a
use,
weekend.
commercial use, right? They have less.
Urban cottage.
Well, they just,
Right, that's what I'm-
commercial has less property right by just being commercial than an individual home. Look, we can go in and pass or fail them, right? Like, you can't open up business.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah,
I was
think
just.
we're in agreement, yeah.
Yes, I was agreeing with you, yeah.
It's true, because we restricted, I remember from planning issues with someone having in-home daycare, and the concerns were very much the same. It was parking lots and,
Use, yeah.
it's like a disruption of the
Appointment-
neighborhood.
Appointment by only small business by appointment, having homes that
exactly.
allow for
Limit the
that.
timing, absolutely,
Sure.
absolutely, absolutely.
So you're saying you don't feel we can ban short-term rentals?
No, and even if, at the end of the day, it's your ordinance. Could you do it? Of course you could. Do you want to be the test case for Airbnb coming in and challenging? Do you want to be that one? No, I don't think, you don't have the budget, this city does not have the budget for it.
Okay, fair enough.
You get fair housing involved, and all
Are
of a
you-
sudden,
Precisely.
we pull up, you're going to be a test case for, okay, well, we're going to have upzoning, and you have no control over your zoning for your residences anymore. And then you're going to have multiple, different types of homes in the middle of your residences, and we have no control over that anymore. I guess I'm concerned about with the state legislation that's potentially could be enacted. Where do we bump up against that? What's the time frame to have something in place? I think it's a.
I think, I agree with Aaron, that I don't think you're going to see anything in advance of November, just politics being what they are. After November, it was going to be a crapshoot, you don't know, but most likely one of them will advance. At one point or another, something will advance. And if, my God honest fear is that the one that deals with zoning and takes away zoning from a municipality, that's probably the worst case scenario. And if I have an impetus to do anything and to bring anything to you is with that in mind. And you have to.
So let's say that passes, that whatever it is, and that we have our ordinance in place. Could it be that, okay, the
So
state comes
registration
in
and
and.
inspection are not being affected necessarily, not in anything that we see proposed right now. So nonetheless, at least we'll have that component. We'll have some nuisance component. We have a mechanism to get to, a certain amount of violations before we yank your rights, right? We have something in place. I think that will go a long way. It's not going to be, so the perfect should not be the enemy of the good, right? We're going to have something in place that's going to get to a lot of it. Will it accomplish all goals that this body may have for itself? Absolutely not. Will
Okay.
it fix the problem once and for all? Of course not.
Well, it may be preempted by state legislation.
True.
And at that point in time, once we have something on the books, would we have to be required to go back and
Well,
take a look at it
I'll give you
again?
an example. Yeah, I mean, you could, depending on what comes out. I'll give you an example. This body passed several years ago, and we still have it on the books. We have an ordinance that prohibits the transportation of marijuana, a certain amount of marijuana. Obviously, marijuana is legal now. And in many respects, that ordinance which deals with transportation is unlawful, okay? It's no longer a viable ordinance. However, marijuana is only legal for up to, let's say, 3 ounces, right, for personal use. If we catch you with 3.5 ounces and transporting it, right, we're off to the races. And we're off to the races. It could be as a possession of marijuana, it could be as unlawful transportation of marijuana. So there's use to that ordinance, and that's why we haven't brought it back to you to be able to take it away from the books, because we found use for it. It's an unintended use, but we found use nonetheless. And I think and we didn't know what the marijuana, was gonna look like, when we crafted that original ordinance. I think the same holds true here today. We're gonna do the best with the tools and with our ability to foresee the future, but will we deal with all issues? No, probably not.
Yeah, I guess my stand on it is throw the kitchen sink at it for this. That doesn't run us afoul of fair housing.
Yes.
That doesn't run us afoul of property rights ownership. That doesn't run us afoul of having to recreate the wheel once the state legislation, whatever that may be, is passed.
I couldn't agree more.
Can I add something there? I might be wrong, but almost every ordinance I recall says at the end, if state of Michigan puts blah, 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 then it defaults to the state of Michigan. So like, aren't we protected in that way? Like, if state of Michigan.
No, state of Michigan, yeah, in that sense, whatever state of Michigan, would come in, they would occupy the field.
So it's like if we as a city, we have to operate by state of Michigan. So what's in our ordinance, we're not going to get sued if it's in our ordinance, only if we're enforcing our ordinance in state of Michigan preempts that.
And you're perhaps practically correct, but you're technically incorrect. legally
People will
speaking.
just sue?
Of course.
Okay.
Because, an entity like whatever entity is going to enforce on behalf of the Fair Housing Act will sue on the ordinance. I'll give you
You guys
Troy's
keep saying
example.
fair housing, but fair housing,
Well,
this bill is not fair housing, right? Like, there's a lot of things.
It's the effect on
Right.
the renter,
Yeah.
right? Don't think about the bill. Yeah, I agree, the bill would never, but the effect on the rental, the chilling effect on whomever is utilizing base and is
But
no longer
in
deprived.
terms of litigation and the people that are opposing, and I'm not saying your ordinance, I'm saying state of Michigan's ordinance, it's a big thing. Fair housing is a big thing as an opposition to the state of Michigan's bill, because it's outright, especially like you said, corporations were at close to 30%. So there's a different mechanism. It's commercial. It's
And we
not
have no jurisdiction on
property
who
rights.
those corporations are that start to buy them. They could be from Toledo, Ohio. They could be from Toledo, Spain. They could be from who
They
knows
hide
where.
under LLCs, which is one of the things that they talked about.
Yeah.
They could be in India, China.
Exactly, and that's.
Which would be great. We like India and China, just for the record.
So Ron, I guess I think where we're trying to go is we like an ordinance draft that is strict as possible, restrictive as possible, without running afoul of all the various laws out there. Just a few thoughts I have is, I think one of our ordinances said you can have 2 people per room plus 2 per floor. That would be a 3-bedroom house, 2-story bungalow could have 10 people. I think that's excessive. I think the
that's
Ferndale
fair,
ordinance you referred to, 2 per room.
Yeah,
is
maximum
fine.
of 8. I know Ferndale had 2 per room, maximum of 8, for example. But I understand your point about
Yeah.
being as, pursuant to health, safety, welfare, and our authority under those concepts of the Home Rule City Act will be as restrictive as possible when we bring it back to you.
Now, another thing I think we should consider is, as you already pointed out, Clawson is not Novi, it's not West Bloomfield. Our lots tend to be small.
Yes.
We as Clawsonites, like most people in Madison Heights, Royal Oak, we're talking 40 to 50-foot lots. We're all kind of cuddled up close to each other in a real estate sense, so we all have to get along. A short-term renter, whether it's somebody who has a 28-day lease or somebody who's coming in as an Airbnb, doesn't have the same incentive to be a good neighbor. Now, I've been in Airbnbs before. They tend to be large homes, what I viewed as a successful large home on a large lot, plenty of parking. I looked at that and thought, yeah, I guess this works. I have a hard time visualizing that working well in the city of Clawson. We've already got 2 complaints off 5 Airbnbs. Can we possibly put restrictions such as, if you want to function as an Airbnb, your building must have a certain amount of clearance to your property line. Similar to building restrictions, but here would be,
I think that's an absolute yes, and that's actually a great idea.
Can I ask a question to you? I know that you asked about restricting them outright. Were you talking about out of the city point blank, or out of residential and allowing it for commercial use, or even other, multifamily type use?
I was just asking the most restrictive, extreme question to start, and then wanted to work my way.
Okay, sorry, I didn't
somewhere
mess
close
up
in the
your-
middle.
I didn't wanna
That's why
mess
I
up your
just kinda
group.
walk it.
Okay.
No, I understand.
Because it-
No, the question that you're asking is not the most extreme. Actually, it's perfectly reasonable, and it falls squarely within health, safety, and welfare. Now, this is going to be the theme throughout the evening, so it's not extreme.
Okay, well, when I say extreme, to totally ban short-term rentals.
No, let's not use that language at all. Health, safety, and welfare, you're well within our rights to do so.
Well, okay, fair enough. Then, but I guess that's what I'm getting at is I can I've experienced Airbnbs that seem to work well. But I've been on every street in this city and I pretty well know what they all look like and I know how big their lots are. And I'm going to say, just in my opinion, there's not even 10% of our homes would qualify, just in my opinion, to be an Airbnb having the proper size and the proper clearance to the property lines.
I
That's
think-
my opinion.
I think your point with respect to making it will require a little bit of analysis, and I'm not the perfect one to be set up for it, but administration will take care of it. Your point with respect to clearance on many aspects of it, or like the functionality of the space, is well taken, and I think that's a very good idea. So we'll take that up and come up with a proposal based on what we find.
Is there a way, would you feel that a more transient in and out, all hours of the day and night might fit a downtown upper level use? Or do you feel like that's still a little bit too much?
I guess I'm imagining anything zoned residential.
Okay.
Currently would have these clearance requirements. Once you get into an actual something zoned for rental, I imagine you have to accommodate that.
I just want to make sure we're only addressing the residential
Well,
component
I
in
would
that
say,
comment.
having taken advantage of an Airbnb in Munising, which was above a coffee shop downtown, I think that's.
It's
Well,
fun.
that's where
Yeah.
cities get creative, and they
Yeah.
just do residential. They encourage it in their downtown business areas because then people
Absolutely.
stay there and they walk downstairs, they go to the restaurants, go to the shops,
Yep.
and you don't have the garbage and the noise issues because it's coming from the downtown area anyway. And there's other cities like St. Clair Shores banned them from residential, but they allowed them on major roads. Like if you're up and down Harper, if you're above, a business, those places. Or single-family homes were banned. Other ones, you had to have a separate, mostly vacation towns. You have to have a separate entrance if it's not a single-family home.
Yep.
Everyone has creative ways of trying to allow yet disallow.
Well, and those two, and I don't know if we're talking about the same one, but a lot of them will distinct between like an owner occupied
Right.
and a commercial investor use where the owner's there. There's the complainant and here's the owner. So I feel like there is a distinction there. I don't know if a lot of, homes that we're referring to right now, but we do have larger homes with larger lots that in the future we might have an accessory use.
The
Who
minimum
knows?
that they all have in common, though, is they all require the same rental standards as your non-owner occupied homes. You got to have the railings, you got to have the
Yes.
fire extinguishers, you have to have the mounted rules, all that stuff that any
Yeah.
rental would have to have.
Yep.
And that's something that these short-term rentals in this town aren't required to have right now.
Yeah, so I
As a
think
point.
that there are a few distinctions we can make with it, like even the residential, if you wanted to possibly allow for a residential use even further. I'm not saying you have to, but it could be an owner occupied, right? Like if it meets certain criteria. It's something that I've seen, and then they've restricted the commercial investor, what they call it, use to be in the downtown-ish areas, right? So that if there are issues, the person is right there on site, right? And it seems, I don't know how legal it might be. It might be, something we have to change. But like I said before, I like making alterations later not trying to come back after we've kind of had a free flow. Maybe, I don't know. I didn't know how this night was gonna go, but I do have to run because my kids have bedtime. Is it okay? Is it okay if I so are we only addressing, we're only gonna address right now at this point, just to be clear, because I don't wanna bombard you. The registration and the enforcement mechanisms, correct?
I'm willing to receive any and all information that you have and you'd like to share with me, as well as anybody else.
Okay,
My thought has been all along that this is the first piece of the larger rental puzzle that makes sense for council to address. And, because if we have registration and inspection, we've got a process in place. We're designating a process, we've begun the work. Then zoning would become important and other aspects of enforcement, but I'll take it all. It makes no difference. And I think, I certainly, from what I've heard tonight, I've taken notes, and I know August has as well. We'll combine our notes, we'll do our research, and we'll bring back, even if it is these two proposed ordinances sort of revamped, hopefully with a more health, safety, and welfare concern at a higher level and a higher degree, to be able to have something that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I'll take any and all commentary, obviously, with respect to this and more.
okay, all right, well, thanks. Thanks for letting me talk, guys.
Thank you.
Can we add this topic to the agendas of both planning and zoning and then come back?
Absolutely.
I think then we can get, people might not be available to come here
Yeah,
like today to talk, but it would give their bodies the opportunity to determine what implications this may bring for them, and also maybe to highlight things that we didn't think of on our own. And it's just, another 16 people or whatever for
I
a
agree.
viewpoint.
You're absolutely correct. I will bring it up to planning and zoning. I think it makes a lot of sense, particularly as we're talking about zoning issues down the road, so it makes a lot of sense.
Right?
We'll do.
Does both of them have to go before, or can
No,
the
planning is the
rental
critical-
Can the rental, not the short term, the short term, obviously, you're talking about the short term to go to planning.
Mm-hmm.
Is it essential that the rental, as it is right now, has to
Not
go
as
before
it is
planning?
right now, but as the issue, I think Madam Mayor is talking about as an issue, as a zoning issue that we can foresee in the future, and also as these bodies are obviously stakeholders in the community, if I collected your information.
You got it, thank you.
So in that sense, I agree. I think it makes sense, and I think we should take it.
Just as a matter of whether it's outside of the scope or not, but you said health, safety, and welfare. Is sustainability also a
Yes.
possibility that we could be looking at from that aspect?
I think that makes sense. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, but, does anyone else like to speak? You're getting up, is it to go forward or backwards? Could go either way. The best of the best, as always.
Yeah, I wish this would have been publicized a little bit better. I expected more of the planning commission here and residents also. Greg and Sarah, I'm on the planning commission. I think it's a wonderful discussion tonight. You guys went through a lot of good points. I state myself that I am not a fan of Airbnbs. However, I used to own a rental house in town, so I know what that's like. You rent a house, sometimes you get good people in there, and they stay for a long time, and everything's hunky-dory. Then you get some bad people in, and it takes you over a year to kick them out and move on with the thing. We're not going to change, as far as I understand here, the rental housing in the city of Clawson. What we're looking at changing what I would call a short-term rental.
Correct.
Bed and breakfast.
Yes, sir.
Type deal. I like looking at it more as a business perspective, so that it's not just a resident owning a house, it's a business that's going in. And because of businesses, I like the parking idea. You have to have so much parking space for, let's hit them with as much as we can, make it as difficult as we can for it, same as we did with the marijuana issue. You said that previously that we're stuck with the 5 we have. No matter what we do now, they're grandfathered in. Let's attack them anytime we can. Out of the 5, you got complaints on 2 of them. Find out who they are, follow up on it. If there's noise, activities, if the neighbors are complaining, give them a rough run for their money. Make it,
Greg, we're going to be nothing but gracious hosts who enforce the law fairly, accurately,
objectively.
with resolve.
I think that's what he just said.
I think so
Right?
too. I
Yeah,
think so
that's
too.
pretty much what I said. If they're running a business out of a house,
I think,
And it's-
and I think you have a lot of support in that sense. I know that city manager made that exact point to me before coming to this meeting, and I think there's value in that statement, and we're going to have to analyze that properly. I could see some softness in the legal argument behind it.
the wording, yes.
But I think there's something that hopefully we can work out, because I think that's one other way. And again, and this is what this exercise is all about, because after all, I hadn't thought about that point until Joe mentioned it. I hadn't thought about sustainability until Mr. Shepherd mentioned it. So, yeah, that's great, but we are going to address that issue as well.
I think your job would be to look at all the legal issues of it and give us as much legal advice as you can on business.
Yes, sir.
And let's give them a rough time if that's what we want. Apparently, the three of them are doing okay. Nobody's being complained about. But the two that are being complained about, if the neighbors are calling police or calling in complaints, that's another problem. We don't have the enforcement. We can't, like you said, we can't do it on the weekend. There's no one there to enforce it. And Monday morning, it's too late. They're gone. So if we make it harder on the guy that's actually doing the operation, he owns the building, he's running it, penalize him somehow for the bad activities of his renters. That's the only way I can see going at it. I look forward to your legal opinion.
Nothing but gracious host. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, then,
Thank you very much for doing this. This is very helpful. We appreciate it.
So-
I'll take to planning, and then if this makes sense to the body, I'll take this to planning, zoning. We'll hopefully start addressing with them as well, collect thoughts, and then bring back to you. I don't know if it makes sense to have another workshop before we come to the body, but it may. I'll take your guidance in that regard.
let's see what the, what kind of tension, what the conversations are, right?
And then maybe what I'll do is I'll communicate with you, and then we'll speak at the next meeting.
Are you getting alerts on the movement of the
Yes.
legislation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Then, if there's nothing else, let's go home. Anyone want to go home?
Sure.
Let's adjourn our workshop. This
Thank
workshop
you.
is closed. Thank you for participating. Everyone have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. We are having coffee with council at 7. If you just want to come say hi, tell us how much you love this great city and all the people who represent you and work for you here. We would love to see that. If you have any other concerns, we'd be happy to spend a few minutes before the meeting talking with you about that as well. And other than that, we'll have a good evening. Thank you.